For over 110 years, the Union Pacific and Southern Pacific Railroads and their predecessors have been competing for traffic between the Midwest and Southwest while running their trains over the same 168 miles of shared track south of St. Louis. How well do these railroads cooperate in running their trains on this busy line that has often hosted the hottest trains on each railroad? Sometimes pretty well. Other times, well, see for yourself. For 123 miles between Valley Junction in East St. Louis and Illmo, Missouri, the trains of both railroads operate on Union Pacific's Chester subdivision, which is mostly two main tracks signaled in each direction. For 46 miles from Illmo to Dexter, Missouri, trains of both railroads operate on the mostly single-track Illmo district of the Southern Pacific. This single-track line between Illmo and Dexter is one of the busiest in this country, with 45 or more freight trains in 24 hours on most days. That single-track section is where we videotape the UP and SP trains along the Mississippi River. And as you will hear and see, the changes in the number and type of trains operated by both railroads have been considerable in the last 25 years. This tape covers 24 hours of continuous UP and SP action on their joint line between Illmo and Dexter in the fall of 1994. Illmo lies about 120 miles south of St. Louis on the west bank or Missouri side of the Mississippi River. Illmo is a crew change point for the former Cotton Belt or St. Louis Southwestern, now a fully integrated part of the Southern Pacific Railroad. SP crews run to East St. Louis and 131 miles to Jonesboro out of Illmo. Union Pacific trains used to change crews on the other side of the river, but UP crews now run between East St. Louis or DuPont and Poplar Bluff, a distance of about 190 miles. UP manifest trains from St. Louis originate at the Alton and Southern's Gateway Yard in East St. Louis, as do most of the Southern Pacific trains. Union Pacific intermodal trains from St. Louis originate at DuPont. Over half of the Union Pacific trains come off of the Chicago subdivision onto the Chester sub at Gorham, 39 miles north of Illmo. Most of these trains come from Chicago or off of Conrail at St. Elmo, Illinois. Crews on these trains begin their journey at Salem, 88 miles northeast of Gorham, and run through to Poplar Bluff. There are 6 sidings between Illmo and Dexter Junction, averaging 6 miles apart, with short sections of double track at both ends of the Southern Pacific-owned joint track. All but Messler and Ardiola sidings are over 2 miles long. The tracks of both railroads between East St. Louis and Poplar Bluff and Jonesboro lie in the Mississippi Valley and are table flat. The only real speed restriction between Illmo and Dexter is at Delta, where the track crosses a former Missouri Pacific branch and turns to the south around a tight curve. The night scenes were shot on the north side of Bell City, just south of Messler Siding. Here is the Southern Pacific Yard Office at Illmo. Illmo is actually in the town of Scott City, about 4 miles south of Cape Girardeau, Missouri. The Southern Illinois and Missouri Bridge Company Bridge over the Mississippi River at Thebes, jointly owned by both the UP and SP, is about 3 miles behind the camera. SP train crews pick up their orders at Illmo from a computer. Most of the yard tracks at Illmo have been pulled up. No clerical people or switch crews are based there anymore. A 3-day-a-week local serves Illmo from the south. Most SP trains just change crews and go. UP trains roll through Illmo about 30 miles an hour, slowing to pick up their lunch at a stand a half-mile west of this yard office. More on this lunch stand later. We arrived at Illmo at 10 in the morning on Friday, September 30th, 1994, just when a 3-hour maintenance-of-way window began. A work crew was installing switch ties and cell, the normally 50-mile-per-hour equilateral switch at the end of double track 2 miles west of Illmo. By the time this gang was in the clear at 1 p.m., The UP was sending out new crews for some of their northbounds, and the Southern Pacific dispatcher was not a happy camper as he had a dozen trains backed up on both sides of Illmo. Midway between Ansel and the next siding at Quarry, Union Pacific's PIHO, who has been patiently waiting in Illmo for 3 hours, slowly heads south at 12 minutes after 1 p.m. after passing through the slow-ordered switch at Ansel. PIHO stands for Pittsburgh to Houston. This is a run-through train from Conrail that originated at Conway Yard near Pittsburgh early yesterday morning and was turned over to the UP at St. Illmo, Illinois, 155 miles northeast of Illmo on the Chicago subdivision. PIHO has blocks for Houston, Alexandria, Louisiana, and Livonia, Louisiana, a new yard serving the chemical plants between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. At Salem, PIHO swaps blocks, setting out cars for North Little Rock and picking up cars for Houston and Livonia. This block swapping practice was begun by the Missouri Pacific predecessor to the UP in the late 1970s to keep trains out of their swamped yards and has been continued by Union Pacific. Most of this train is empty tank cars that carry chemicals from Texas and Louisiana to the northeast on the return trip. A few of these tank cars are loaded as chemical intermediates move both ways, but this train is mostly empties. On PIHO's block 9 minutes later is westbound Union Pacific CHLI from Chicago to the new yard at Livonia, Louisiana. CHLI has more empty chemical tanks and covered hoppers used to transport plastic pellets to the same points as PIHO. At Poplar Bluff, PIHO and CHLI will swap blocks. CHLI will handle the Louisiana cars out of Poplar Bluff and avoid being classified at North Little Rock. The autos in this train are bound for a distribution center at Westfield, Texas, outside of Houston. 9 minutes later, the UP's ASNL from the Alton & Southern's yard in East St. Louis to North Little Rock rolls by the same point. ASNL is running way late today, in part because of the maintenance of Way Wendell and has cars for Poplar Bluff and the former Missouri Pacific Hump Classification Yard at North Little Rock, 216 miles south of here. ASNL has more manufactured goods than empty chemical cars, including 2 cars of Budweiser beer and the manufacturer's railway insulated boxcars, a sure sign that this train originated in St. Louis. After 3 southbounds, we get a northbound at the same place 10 minutes later, The UP's NLIN behind Conrail Power. NLIN had been sitting in Quarry Siding a mile west of here for the last 2 hours. NLIN will be recrewed after crossing the Mississippi River, delayed by the maintenance of Wendell and by just plain too many trains on this single-track line. This train is about 7 hours behind schedule. NLIN stands for North Little Rock to Indianapolis on Conrail. This is one of 3 northbounds and 4 southbounds that are interchanged most days between the UP and Conrail at St. Illmo. NLIN has wallboard and paperboard and empty steel gondolas and auto racks, along with many chemicals. It is blocked for Avon Yard at Indianapolis and Elkhart Yard on Conrail. The Union Pacific uses an alpha train symbol system for their trains, with the first 2 letters of manifest or carload trains referring to the point where the train originates, and the last 2 letters to the point where the train terminates. Intermodal trains have a postscript Z, auto trains a postscript V as in vehicles, while some trains use subscripts in front of their symbol, such as grain trains, which use a GL or GE for grain loads or grain empties. But the UP seems to have exceptions for each type of train symbol. We will see several of these exceptions on upcoming trains. Minutes later, another UP train heads south just west of Ansel. This is the XPIHO for Extra Pittsburgh to Houston. Although symboled in extra, this train now runs most days of the week with the same blocks as the earlier PIHO from Conrail. Again, much of this train is empty chemical tank cars and empty covered hoppers used to transport plastic pellets and other solid chemicals from the Gulf Coast to the Northeast. The Union Pacific serves the lion's share of the chemical and plastic plants on the Gulf Coast on former Missouri Pacific trackage, a main reason for the Union Pacific wanting to buy the Missouri Pacific. These 2 railroads were merged in December of 1982. This chemical traffic increased greatly in the late 1970s and late 1980s, one reason for the big increase in UP trains on this line in the last 2 decades. "17 minutes behind the XPIHO is our first hotshot pulling through the switch at Ansel. This is the Union Pacific's CHMXV with loaded autos and auto parts for assembly plants and unloading points in Mexico. CHMXV originated at the UP's yard known as Yard Center on the south side of Chicago and is bound for Laredo, Texas, where it will be turned over to the National Railway of Mexico. Much of this train was picked up at Salem off of an earlier INFWV from Conrail. This good-sized train was added in the last year and is one example of the increased business between the U.S. and Mexico, partially resulting from the Free Trade Treaty. Another train for Laredo will follow an hour from now. This train will head south and then southeast through Little Rock, Texarkana, Palestine, and San Antonio to Laredo, all on former Missouri Pacific track. CHMXV is passing through the switch at the end of two main tracks at Ansel, where the long ties or switch timbers were being replaced just over an hour ago. The work gang is not finished, and this equilateral switch, where the points curve equally together from both tracks, remains slow-ordered. The speed limit through this switched turnout is normally 50 miles per hour. During the Southern Pacific's go-go days of the 1960s and early 70s, this switch was rated at 65 miles per hour, and there was also no speed restriction over the Burlington Northern Diamond just ahead at Rockview Junction. CHMXV and other UP trains from Chicago and the Chicago subdivision follow former Chicago and Eastern Illinois track for 330 miles from Chicago to Gorham. The Missouri Pacific acquired the CNEI in 1967, giving them a direct route from Chicago to Texas and the Gulf Coast, and an important edge over their arch rival, the Cotton Belt. The UP has continued to build on this advantage. The Cotton Belt, on whose tracks these trains are running, has lost its identity within the Southern Pacific system in recent years. "20 minutes later, another Union Pacific train heads north, just west of Ansel, having met the two previous southbounds at Quarry Siding. At this time, the SP dispatcher has trains meeting each other in just about every siding between here and where the UP trains head out onto their own tracks at Dexter. Like the earlier trains, NLAS is moving slowly because the slow-ordered turnout at Ansel is just a mile ahead. NLAS from North Little Rock has some intermodal traffic for the ramp at Dupont. Most of this train is bound for the Alton and Southern's Gateway Yard in East St. Louis. All Missouri Pacific and later Union Pacific trains in St. Louis used to originate and terminate at Dupont, about 6 miles south of St. Louis, on the Illinois side of the Mississippi. In 1986, the UP closed Dupont as a classification yard and moved all manifest or carload train classification to Gateway Yard. The Alton and Southern is owned equally by the UP and SP. Dupont became the intermodal yard for the St. Louis area, and the number of trailers and containers out of there has increased quite a bit in the last few years. Coal and unit trains also change crews or are stored at Dupont. The number of UP trains from St. Louis through here has undergone quite a few changes in the last 20 years. In the early 1970s, the Missouri Pacific ran around 7 freights in each direction to and from St. Louis, and 3 trains each way from Chicago. In the ensuing years, more traffic was routed through Chicago, giving the MOP and later the UP the longer haul. St. Louis was also declining as a railroad gateway. By 1987, only 4 trains through here came from St. Louis, with 2 of these trains being intermodal trains from Chicago routed through DuPont. Another change in the number of trains running via St. Louis came just over 2 years ago. North Platte and Kansas City to Memphis trains used to run to Memphis via Carthage, Missouri and Cotter, Arkansas, and did not run through here. When the UP spun off the line through Carthage and Cotter to the Missouri and northern Arkansas 2 years ago, the through intermodal and manifest trains from North Platte and Kansas City to Memphis were routed via St. Louis through here. A couple of other symbols have been added in the last year, including a new V for vehicle train from St. Louis, and the number of UP trains from East St. Louis through here is the highest it has been in many years. Nine minutes later, another Union Pacific northbound heads for DuPont. This is the MENPNS, a relatively new schedule from the Norfolk Southern at Memphis to North Platte via St. Louis and Kansas City. This non-standard symbol stands for Memphis, North Platte, Norfolk Southern. The 7,500-foot-long NLAS up ahead is picking up his lunch at the lunch stand in Illmo, while more UP southbounds is sitting on the other main track, preventing this hot train from running around the slower NLAS until he is across the Thieves Bridge. When the Union Pacific eliminated the crew change point at Gale on the other side of the river in 1949, and crews ran through from DuPont to Poplar Bluff, the price the railroad paid was a meal midway in their run to each crew member. This has remained in the crew's contract ever since. Crews phone their orders in when going on duty at Poplar Bluff, Salem, DuPont, or East St. Louis, and call the beanery on the radio when they are close to Illmo. Lunches are usually picked up from a special stand, which you will see later. If the food is not ready, the train stops and waits. MENPNS has some intermodal for DuPont. The rest of a short train is for the UP's huge hump classification yard at North Platte, Nebraska. This train replaces the NLNP from North Little Rock, which initially ran through here when the Memphis to Kansas City trains were shifted to this route 2 years ago. "20 minutes later and 5 miles further west at the west end of Quarry Siding, also known as Rockview Junction, northbound UP train NLSM clatters across the Burlington Northern Diamond and heads into Quarry Siding. The former St. Louis and San Francisco, now Burlington Northern line from St. Louis to Memphis, crosses the SP-UP joint track directly under the highway bridge. NLSM is basically a drag from North Little Rock and picks up or sets out at Poplar Bluff, Missouri, and at Bush and Mount Vernon in Illinois. Former Missouri Pacific branch lines join the Chicago subdivision near Bush and at Mount Vernon. The former B&O main line from St. Louis to the East Coast, now CSX's main route to St. Louis, crosses the UP Chicago subdivision at Salem. Much of this train, including most of the tanks of chemicals and covered hoppers of plastic pellets and chemicals, were blocked at North Little Rock for CSX at Salem. As soon as NLSM clears, UP southbound hotshot CHDAZ from Chicago, who had been waiting on the main, begins to pull. The power includes a GP50 from their merger partner, the Chicago and Northwestern. CHDAZ is a 29-hour intermodal or Z train from Chicago to the UP's main intermodal ramp for Dallas-Fort Worth at Mesquite, Texas, 11 miles east of Dallas. CHDAZ also has cars for their East Texas ramp at Marshall. This train was begun in the mid-'80s as the UP began to take advantage of their having the fastest route between Chicago and Texas. CHDAZ has some new UP domestic containers double stacked in the front of the train, in addition to a number of truckers' trailers. Right on CHDAZ's block is the UP's CHMXZ for Mexico City. This train was begun about 1988 as the AIZ for Automotive Industry Intermodal, carrying auto parts and intermodal traffic from Chicago to Mexico via the Laredo Gateway. Now the auto parts are handled on the earlier CHMXV and the intermodal traffic on this train. CHMXZ is out of Chicago with blocks for San Antonio, Laredo, and Mexico City. The American President's Line containers are bound for Mexico. There are a number of J.B. Hunt and Snyder National trailers on this train. The J.B. Hunt trailers are bound for San Antonio and Mexico. The UP carries Snyder National trailers to all the UP's major intermodal ramps in Texas. Minutes after CHMXZ cleared quarry, a northbound hammers the BN Diamond, having met the CHMXZ at Delta 5 miles west of here. The symbol for this UP northbound is XLDAS, an extra or second section of LDAS from Laredo on the Mexico border to the Alton and Southern's Gateway Yard in East St. Louis. XLDAS has autos for eastern and midwestern destinations assembled in Mexico and also from the General Motors plant in Arlington, Texas, midway between Fort Worth and Dallas. Laredo on the former Missouri Pacific is the largest gateway for rail traffic between the U.S. and Mexico. "20 minutes later, another northbound UP train heads over the BN Diamond and through the west switch of Quarry Siding. This is the LICH from Livonia, Louisiana to Chicago. Livonia is a new flat switch yard opened up earlier this year and is about 100 miles west of New Orleans near Baton Rouge. Livonia is also where the line from Houston to Baton Rouge crosses the line from New Orleans to North Little Rock. The UP serves most of the many chemical and plastic plants located along the west bank of the Mississippi River between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and all these trains from that region or North Little Rock are loaded with tank cars and covered hoppers carrying chemicals and covered hoppers carrying plastic pellets. LICH is headed to the former C&EI yard known as Yard Center in Dolton, a southern suburb of Chicago. This flat switch yard has been downgraded and is now mostly intermodal, but some cars are still switched there, particularly those bound for the Grand Trunk Western, who runs a train into and out of Yard Center each day. This accounts for the empty autos and auto parts cars on this train. "10 minutes behind LICH at 4:05 p.m. is DADUZ from the Mesquite Intermodal Yard near Dallas to DuPont. DADUZ is operated primarily for United Parcel Service, and there are a number of their distinctive trailers on this train. DADUZ sets out trailers for Memphis at Bald Knob and picks up trailers for St. Louis at North Little Rock. DADUZ has 2 trains backed up in front of him, passing over the slow-ordered switch at Ansel 5 miles ahead and picking up their lunches at Illmo. The speed limit over the BN diamond in the background that DADUZ is crossing over is 40 miles per hour, and the limit for freights is 60 over most of this joint track between Illmo and Dexter. The BN runs around 6 or 7 trains each day in this line from St. Louis to Memphis that crosses the UP here at Rockview Junction, but we won't be lucky enough to catch one of their trains during our stay here. This Burlington Northern line was hit hard by the Great Mississippi River flood in the summer of 1993, as was the Union Pacific line north of Gorham to East St. Louis. Next, southbound Union Pacific ASHOV heads out of Quarry Siding after meeting the last 3 northbounds. ASHOV for Alton and Southern to Houston vehicles has cars for Setgast Yard in Houston and the auto and loading ramp at Westfield outside of Houston. This symbol was added earlier this year. This is the 15th Union Pacific train that we have seen, and not a single SP train has been by yet. That ought to tell you something about the relative traffic levels between the UP and SP through here today. In the early 1970s, the number of trains and cars was about the same between the Missouri Pacific and Cotton Belt on this line, 8 to 10 trains on each railroad per day in each direction, averaging as many as 90 cars per train. Outside of their main transcontinental line from Kansas City and Omaha to Ogden through North Platte, this line is UP's busiest. The UP line through North Platte runs as many as 100 trains in 24 hours and carries the most tonnage of any rail line in the world, but that is another story. 20 minutes later, another UP northbound heads into the siding at Quarry, having met ASHOV at Delta. This is the regular or first section of LDAS from Laredo to East St. Louis. This new train has less chemical traffic and more boxcars on his train than the northbounds that were carrying traffic from Livonia or the Gulf Coast. He also has some empty auto parts cars returning from Mexico. The turnout speeds on these sidings are only 25 miles per hour today, although they used to be 35 miles per hour. If the Southern Pacific would put higher speed turnouts in their sidings, it would speed up the many meets on this line. Of course, any speed up would help the UP more than the SP, so don't expect such an improvement to happen as long as the SP has title to this track. Heard on the scanner was a comment from the SP dispatcher to a UP train that we are fixing up this track so that you can buy it, so stop complaining about all the delays. With all the time spent sitting in sidings, negative banter on the radio is quite commonplace. Finally, at 4:38 p.m., we get our first SP train, the ASSRQ, from East St. Louis to Strang Yard near Houston, behind a pair of brand new radio-trucked SD-70Ms. All the Southern Pacific's trains out of St. Louis, except for intermodal trains, also originate at the Alton & Southern's Gateway Yard in East St. Louis. Strang Yard is a key classification point for chemical traffic south of Houston. ASSRQ has blocks for Strang and Pine Bluff, Arkansas. At Pine Bluff, this train will pick up additional cars for Nacogdoches, located between Shreveport and Houston, and for Strang. Like many of the southbound UP manifests, this train has many empty tank cars and covered hoppers that will carry chemicals and plastic pellets from the Gulf Coast on a return trip. The Southern Pacific also uses a letter or alpha train symbol system, with the first two letters for the originating point, two letters for the terminating point, and a postscript letter for the type of train. M is used for ordinary manifest, Q for priority manifest, and F, T, or X for intermodal or expedited trains. Next is a pan shot of a UP northbound leaving Delta after meeting the SP train. Delta is the next siding west of here. This is the NLCHBR from North Little Rock to the Belt Railway's clearing yard in the south side of Chicago. The BRC classifies most of the UP's carload or manifest type traffic in Chicago. This train picked up cars for clearing from the earlier LICH, which then had only cars for Yard Center. This is the 17th UP train in the 4 hours since the maintenance of way window opened, and there are more coming. Another southbound UP hotshot is next at 5:16 p.m. at Delta. This is the NYDAZ from Conrail at St. Illmo, with blocks from Mesquite Yard near Dallas and Houston. He met the NLCHBR at Quarry and is right on time so far. The Houston cars will be set out at Gurdon, Arkansas for CHHOZ, who will be through here tomorrow morning. Just behind the camcorder, NYDAZ is crossing a former Missouri Pacific branch line, which has undergone a couple of owners since it was sold off in the mid-'80s and now looks abandoned. The speed limit over the diamond is 25 miles per hour and is 40 miles per hour around the big curve behind the camcorder where the track turns sharply to the south, at times hugging the bluffs along the Mississippi. NYDAZ originated at Cleveland and has quite a few truckers' trailers on it. Conrail's symbol for this train is TV55. NYDAZ will only make it as far as the next siding at Randall's before it gets sidetracked for more northbounds. After a 30-minute wait, this northbound appears at Randall's. And what hot train is the NYDAZ waiting for? The northbound Southern Pacific local from Jonesboro, behind a leased unit from EMD with a trainload of grain picked up at local elevators. NYDAZ is still in the siding, and fans look on as another SP northbound charges through Randall's 9 minutes later. This looks like the SRASQ, with mostly chemical traffic from Strang Yard south of Houston for the Alton and Southern in East St. Louis. The great speed-up of Cotton Belt and SP schedules in the late 1950s and early 1960s resulted in tonnage on the Cotton Belt almost doubling on this line from the late 1950s to its peak around 1972. The Blue Streak merchandise, or BSM, was speeded up to an incredible 50 1/2 hours from East St. Louis to Los Angeles. This included a nearly unattainable 53 mile per hour average on the Cotton Belt through here, including time spent picking up Memphis cars at Pine Bluff. The BSM was the fastest freight train in the world in the 1960s and very early 1970s, and the employees knew it. By late 1971, the BSM was bombing through here in 2 good-sized sections and running in 3 sections south of Pine Bluff. 4 run-through trains from Penn Central, the B&O, and the N&W were running out of East St. Louis to Pine Bluff each day. 9 or 10 good-sized Cotton Belt trains were running through here each way per day by 1971. 11 minutes later, another northbound rolls by NYDAZ, this time a UP train. This is the Union Pacific's HOAS from Houston to East St. Louis, with a mixture of chemicals, empty autos, intermodal flats, and miscellaneous traffic from different points in the Gulf Coast to be classified at Gateway Yard. At Poplar Bluff, HOAS picked up cars for a small yard at Flinton, 50 miles south of East St. Louis, and additional cars for Gateway Yard. UP has another line from Poplar Bluff to St. Louis through DeSoto, Missouri that is used by Amtrak. With grades and short sidings, the only freight traffic that normally uses this route is a local and ballast trains. As you have seen, SP trains generally get the right-of-way on their own track, even over hotter UP trains. After a 55-minute wait, NYDAZ finally gets to head south. Just north of Bell City at 7 p.m., another SP train heads north behind a mixture of power including a leased CSX unit. This looks like the BTASQ from Beaumont, Texas, east of Houston, to the Alton and Southern Yard in East St. Louis. This train picks up chemical traffic from plants between New Orleans and Beaumont, while the earlier SRASQ brings chemicals from south of Houston to Memphis, East St. Louis, and beyond. Both trains set out cars from Memphis at the SP's Hump Classification Yard at Pine Bluff, Arkansas. This yard was the Cotton Belt's primary classification yard and was built in 1858. Southern Pacific moved most of their St. Louis area classification to the Alton and Southern's Gateway Yard in the late 1970s, retaining their Small Valley Junction Yard, which is adjacent to Gateway Yard for intermodal traffic. SRASQ and BTASQ are running several hours late through here. In our first night shot at Bell City, 18 minutes later, another SP train heads north. This looks like PBASM from Pine Bluff to the Alton and Southern Yard in East St. Louis. It has cars off of trains from Shreveport and the Dallas-Fort Worth area that terminated at Pine Bluff. After the tremendous growth in the 1960s and early 70s, the Cotton Belt or Southern Pacific has seen tremendous changes in their freight traffic on this line since then. During the recession in 1974 and 1975, SP traffic on this line in the Southern Pacific system slowly decreased, and the SP stopped buying new locomotives for a number of years. When traffic rebounded in the late 1970s, particularly chemical traffic through here, the SP was not prepared to handle the increase. Schedules and service went to pot, even the Blue Streak merchandise. By then, only one section with left East St. Louis several hours early and still couldn't meet its schedule. When a railroad consistently gives poor service, the inevitable result is less traffic. By 1981, the Cotton Belt, now fully integrated into the Southern Pacific system, was averaging only 6 trains each way through here, and intermodal traffic was half what it had been 10 years earlier. 17 minutes later, another SP northbound charges through Bell City. This is the HOEST, the only hot northbound on the Southern Pacific, with traffic from Houston and Dallas due East St. Louis 4 hours ago. The evening is the busy time for SP northbounds. Southbound UP Hotshot NPMEZ is next, having waited at Messler Siding about a mile north of here for all three SP northbounds. Unfortunately, this sidetracking of UP hotshots for SP trains goes on all the time here on SP track. One problem is that the Southern Pacific has only one hot train in each direction, so the UP can hardly get back at the SP when SP trains are running on UP track on the other side of the Mississippi River. NPMEZ runs off of connections from all three of the Union Pacific's lines to the west coast at North Platte, with cars for Kansas City, DuPont, and Memphis. Run-through service between the UP and the former Southern Railway at Memphis was begun in the late 1970s with trains UMS and SMU for UP Memphis Southern Railway. These trains were initially mixed manifest and piggyback. As intermodal traffic grew, they became solid intermodal or Z trains a few years ago. This train was routed through St. Louis 2 years ago when the more direct route from Kansas City to Memphis through Carthage and Cotter was sold to the Missouri and Northern Arkansas Railway. Just over an hour later, the longest break between trains so far, a UP northbound slows for a red signal at the south end of the siding at Messler. The SP dispatcher was busy and forgot to clear it for him as no other train is nearby. This is the FPCH originating at Freeport, Texas on the Gulf Coast, directly south of Houston, with cars for Yard Center in Chicago. FPCH picks up additional chemicals at Angleton, also south of Houston, and picks up cars for Chicago at Spring, Texas, north of Houston, and at Bauxite Junction, Arkansas, where trains from Fort Worth and Shreveport set out cars for Yard Center. Many of the chemicals on this train come from Dow Chemical, who moves chemical intermediates on this train between their plants on the Gulf Coast and their headquarters at Midland, Michigan. These cars go to the Grand Trunk Western at Yard Center. The UP and SP and their predecessors have been rivals on this joint track for over 110 years. The competition between these two railroads reached its zenith in the 1960s and early 1970s as traffic exploded in both roads and schedules were tightened, especially between East St. Louis and the Southwest. You've already heard about the Southern Pacific's storied Blue Streak merchandise, or BSM, which used to run through here. The BSM was SP's hottest train, running from East St. Louis to Los Angeles in 50½ hours until the early 1970s, when too much traffic and too few locomotives sent SP into a tailspin and its schedule was slowed. In the 1960s and early 70s, the Missouri Pacific ran their hotshot, known as the MTS, for Missouri Pacific, Texas and Pacific, Southern Pacific, later called number 61, out right ahead of the BSM. MTS ran from East St. Louis to Los Angeles via El Paso, where it then ran over SB tracks to Los Angeles. At times, each railroad had standing orders to reverse the train order if one of their hot trains got run around by an inferior train of the other railroad on this joint track. The May 1988 Trains magazine has an excellent article on this line and the dirty tricks that sometimes went on. But the two railroads cooperated also. By the early 1970s, they had no choice. To do otherwise was to court gridlock. The number of trains on this single-track line reached nearly 40 a day by 1972, as the BSM was running in two sections, and auto parts traffic for West Coast assembly plants was booming on the Southern Pacific. On the Missouri Pacific, chemical traffic from the Gulf Coast was beginning to increase, and intermodal traffic was also growing rapidly, with the Missouri Pacific running solid intermodal trains on this line by the late 1970s. "27 minutes later, another new UP symbol heads north. This is the SHASV running behind CSX Power, which originates at Riser, Louisiana, near Shreveport. GM has a big assembly plant at Riser, and most of this train is loaded multi-levels and empty parts cars from that plant, thus the V for vehicles in the symbol. At Bauxite Junction, Arkansas, south of Little Rock, SHASV set out cars for a V train to Conrail that will be along later, and for the earlier FPCH. By swapping blocks, both FPCH and SHASV are able to avoid being reclassified at North Little Rock, and both trains are ahead of their schedule through Bell City. This block swapping was begun by the Missouri Pacific in the late 1970s as traffic on this line reached record levels. Next is the only hot SP southbound. ESDAF, with traffic from East St. Louis to Dallas and Houston, is close to schedule through Bell City at 10 p.m. It will pick up other flats for Dallas from Memphis and Chicago at Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Another SP southbound is next at 10:30 p.m. CHPBM originated at the Belt Railway's Clearing Yard on the south side of Chicago yesterday afternoon and follows the former Gulf, Mobile, and Ohio line to St. Louis that SP acquired when they bought the Chicago, Missouri and Western in November of 1989. After picking up and setting out at the Alton & Southern's Gateway Yard in East St. Louis, CHPBM heads to Pine Bluff, Arkansas. The Cotton Belt built a hump yard there in 1958, and this yard serves a similar function to North Little Rock on Union Pacific. It melds together trains from St. Louis with those from Memphis and classifies most manifest or carload trains. This long train has quite a mix of traffic, from paper, feed grain, and auto parts to empty tank cars and covered hoppers that will carry chemicals and plastic pellets on the return trip. The first northbound UP-Z train of the night is next. Three SD40-2s have the 8,000 feet of trailers and containers on MXCHZ moving pretty well. This train originated at Mexico City 3 days ago and is within 2 hours of its scheduled time through here. MXCHZ picked up more cars from Memphis, Chicago, and DuPont at Laredo, San Antonio, and Texarkana in Texas. At Bald Knob, Arkansas, where the line to Memphis leaves the main, he set out his intermodal cars for Memphis. This train is routed through Chicago through DuPont, one of 1 or 2 Chicago trains in each direction that generally run through East St. Louis and DuPont to Chicago on the former C&EI line that the Missouri Pacific acquired in 1967. The C&EI reached East St. Louis with a line that left what is now called the Chicago subdivision at Findlay, Illinois. Southbound Union Pacific CHNL is next at 12:20 a.m. on Saturday, October 1st, 1994. CHNL originates at Yard Center south of Chicago with auto parts and empty Dow chemical tank cars off of the Grand Trunk Western and other traffic from Yard Center to be humped at North Little Rock. The containers on this train are roll-on, roll-off containers hauling trash. This train was one of the first trains to be added as number 165 between Chicago and Gorham, avoiding East St. Louis after the Missouri Pacific acquired the Chicago and Eastern Illinois in 1867. CHNL was due out of Yard Center at 8 yesterday morning and is close to its schedule through here. Another northbound UP intermodal train is next. DACHZ is a new symbol replacing FWCHZ, as most of the Dallas-Fort Worth intermodal traffic was transferred to a new ramp at Mesquite, east of Dallas, earlier this year. There are a few of the new UP containers on this train. The two SD40-2s have a mile of flats moving near the 60-mile-per-hour speed limit through Bell City. "50 minutes later at 2:05 a.m., another UP-Z train heads north at speed. Two more second-generation units have 6,000 feet of trailers and containers, including quite a few truckers' trailers in tow. This HOCHZ is another new schedule as intermodal traffic between Chicago and Texas is growing, fueled by the return of major truckers to the rails. Both this train from Houston and the earlier MXCHZ from Laredo are on time or close to schedule, offering late second morning arrival at Chicago. Both trains run via Salem, taking the direct route to Chicago. "15 minutes later, another hot UP northbound charges through Bell City. This is the ARINV with loaded autos and empty auto parts cars from the GM assembly plant at Arlington, Texas, bound for Indianapolis on Conrail. It will stop at Salem, where a shuttle crew will take this train to St. Illmo, where Conrail will take over. A UP southbound is next, 18 minutes later. This short train is the ASFW from Gateway Yard, with cars for the former Missouri Pacific Hump Yard at Fort Worth, Texas. Note the lack of cars for carrying chemicals on this train, a sign that it does not go to the Gulf Coast. 20 minutes later, another UP southbound charges through Bell City. This is the INFWV right on schedule from Avon Yard at Indianapolis on Conrail via St. Illmo, with cars for General Motors plants at Reiser and Arlington. Cars for other points on Union Pacific were set out at Salem. Southbound ASNL is next at 3:21 a.m. This UP train from the Alton and Southern Yard in East St. Louis has cars for Poplar Bluff and North Little Rock and picked up more cars at Flinton and Gorham. At Flinton, he set out cars for Reiser and Arlington for CHREV, which will be along shortly. This ASNL is much closer to schedule than yesterday's train that got held by the maintenance away window at Ansell. At 3:51 a.m., another UP intermodal train heads north. This is the MEPDZ from Memphis with blocks for DuPont, North Platte, and West Coast ramps on the UP. Intermodal traffic from CSX and the Norfolk Southern at Memphis has grown in recent years, and this train, begun as the SMU in the 1970s, has recently become an all-intermodal Z train. This train was symboled MENPZ from Memphis to North Platte until earlier this year. Now its destination is Portland, Oregon, the PD in the train symbol, although most of its cars are set off at North Platte for other West Coast destinations on the Union Pacific. There are some truckers' trailers on this train, including 2 new refrigerated trailers from Crete Carrier Corp. A very heavy UP northbound is next and takes the siding at Messler just ahead. This is the NLPI from North Little Rock with blocks for Selkirk Yard near Albany, New York, and Conway Yard near Pittsburgh on Conrail, hence the PI in the symbol for Pittsburgh. At Salem, Illinois, a shuttle crew will take this train to St. Illmo, 27 miles north of Salem, where Conrail will take over. Most of the tank cars and covered hoppers on this train are loads bringing chemicals and plastic pellets from plants along the Mississippi River in Louisiana and along the Gulf Coast. To continue with our story of the many changes in traffic on this line in the last 25 years, ton miles between both railroads actually peaked in 1979, but by that time the Southern Pacific's traffic was headed downhill while Missouri Pacific's traffic was booming. Trains from Chicago via the former Chicago and Eastern Illinois, which the MOP had acquired in 1967, had grown from 1 train each way per day in 1968 to 5 trains each way by 1979, and chemical traffic from the Gulf Coast was booming. The acquisition of the C&EI was probably the critical event in the last 40 years that most affected the competition between these 2 railroads. This gave the Missouri Pacific and later the Union Pacific a direct route to Chicago for all the intermodal traffic from Dallas, Houston, and Mexico, and a direct route to Conrail and Chicago, bypassing congested East St. Louis for all the chemical traffic from the Gulf Coast and Louisiana, something that the Southern Pacific did not have. The SP did purchase the St. Louis to Chicago line of the Chicago, Missouri and Western in late 1989, but the SP has been unable to fully exploit the potential of this route because it is slower having to go through East St. Louis rather than around it, because the Southern Pacific service all over their system continues to languish due to a shortage of power and crews. 5 minutes later, UP's SM&L from Salem to North Little Rock slowly accelerates after being stopped by NLPI entering Messler Siding. SM&L has North Little Rock cars set out by trains from Conrail at Salem and cars from CSX at Salem. CSX typically gives 30 to 50 cars a day to the UP at Salem off of their R379 train. These cars can include some hot autos and auto parts cars. SM&L has 2 more container flats carrying containers of trash. In the mid-1960s, before the Missouri Pacific gained entrance to Chicago, the MOP ran 7 or 8 good-sized freights each way per day through here. The Missouri Pacific had begun to refer to some trains carrying piggyback as the Eagles after their passenger fleet, but no train was solid piggyback at that time. Number 69, which was due out of DuPont at 10 a.m. and due into Dallas at 4:30 a.m. the next morning, carried the most piggyback in the 1960s, 30 or 40 flats. MTS, later called number 61, was the fastest train out of DuPont, scheduled to run from DuPont to Fort Worth in just over 17 hours. These times from the 1960s are faster than the UP makes today with their intermodal trains on this route, but there are twice as many trains on much of this line today. When the MOP gained entrance to Chicago, traffic out of St. Louis declined slowly, but the number of trains from Chicago increased from 1 in 1968 to 5 each way by 1979. When the chemical industry went into a recession in the early 1980s, traffic out of East St. Louis plummeted to as few as 4 trains each way per day, while the number of Chicago trains remained constant as the growth of intermodal balanced the drop in chemical traffic. 2 solid intermodal trains out of Chicago were running on the Missouri Pacific through here by 1980. And SP southbound is next at 4:43 a.m. This is the ASBTQ, which originates at the Alton & Southern's Gateway Yard and is bound for Beaumont, Texas. The last 2 units in the head end were new GEs for the National Railway of Mexico. ASBTQ has blocks for Pine Bluff and Houston in addition to Beaumont. Besides empty tank cars and covered hoppers bound for chemical plants in the Gulf Coast, this train has manufactured goods bound for Texas, particularly steel and pipe, and also has considerable feed grain for poultry producers. ASBTQ is due into Pine Bluff at 10:30 a.m. and is on time through here. The UP Auto train from Chicago, routed via East St. Louis, is next. CHREV was begun earlier this year and picks up St. Louis cars set out by ASNL at Flinton, 50 miles south of East St. Louis. This way, CHREV can just change crews at DuPont and not have to go in a gateway yard to pick up. CHREV has a good-sized train for the GM assembly plants at Arlington, Texas and Reiser, Louisiana. "19 minutes later at 5:12 a.m., a southbound UP intermodal train blasts through Bell City. DUDAZ carries intermodal traffic from DuPont for San Antonio, Laredo, and Mesquite. Cars for destinations other than Mesquite are set out at Gurdon, Arkansas, where Mesquite cars off of a Memphis train are picked up. On some days, including today, DUDAZ will get Mesquite flats from CHFWZ out of Chicago, which terminated at DuPont. On other days, CHFWZ runs as a separate train from Chicago to Fort Worth. Another hot UP southbound is next. This short train running on DUDAZ's block is the NPMENS from North Platte to the Norfolk Southern at Memphis with a mix of intermodal and carload traffic. An hour and 20 minutes later at 6:40 a.m., the last Southern Pacific northbound rolls through Bell City behind quite a conglomeration of power. HOCHQ carries traffic from Houston proper to Memphis, East St. Louis, and Chicago. At Pine Bluff, HOCHQ is reclassified, leaving its East St. Louis, Alton, and Southern cars behind for the next ANS northbound. HOCHQ is out of Pine Bluff with cars for the Terminal Railway of St. Louis, which will be set out at Valley Junction in East St. Louis, and cars for the Belt Railway in Chicago, where this train terminates. Continuing with our story of the tremendous ups and downs of SP's traffic through here, the next big change came in January of 1983. As a condition of the Union Pacific, Missouri Pacific, Western Pacific merger, SP got trackage rights between St. Louis and Kansas City. This allowed the SP to route their Los Angeles traffic out of St. Louis by way of Kansas City and the former Rock Island Golden State route, saving more than 400 miles to Los Angeles. SP bought the line from Kansas City to Tucumcari in 1980 after the Rock Island went out of business. Moving day was January 7th, and 2 trains each way were transferred from this line to the new route to Los Angeles via Kansas City, leaving this line with as few as 3 SP trains in each direction. As soon as the SP train is by, southbound UP train CHLI pulls out of Messler siding. CHLI originated at Yard Center and is headed to the new yard at Livonia, Louisiana. Today's train is much closer to schedule than yesterday's CHLI, which got stabbed by the maintenance of a window. This train was previously symboled CHAL for Chicago to Alexandria. It has blocks for most points on the Gulf Coast. At Salem, CHLI set out GM Autos and auto parts for the earlier INFWV and picked up Louisiana cars set out by Conrail run-through trains. By being pre-blocked, CHLI will be able to bypass the hump at North Little Rock, saving considerable time. After a nearly 2-hour break, northbound Union Pacific NLIN rattles downtown Bell City at 8:25 a.m. This is the same symbol that was the first northbound through the maintenance of way window yesterday. Today's train is much closer to schedule and won't have a maintenance window to contend with, as the switch tie gang will wait until Monday to finish up at Ansel. NLIN has blocks for Conrail's Avon Yard in Indianapolis and Conrail's Elkhart Yard in northern Indiana. Ten minutes later, we get a going-away view of northbound UP train HOAS at Ardiola Siding, the next siding south of Bell City. Yesterday's HOAS was seen at 6:13 last evening at Randall's. Today's train is on time. HOAS carries some empty trailers from Houston that will be set out at DuPont. At this point, the Southern Pacific track is running next to the Mississippi River bluffs, although the river is almost 30 miles east of here. The Mississippi Delta begins around here, as the track at times is surrounded by cotton. A southbound UP-Z train is next an hour later by Ardiola at speed. CHHOZ was the first through train from Chicago on the former Chicago and Eastern Illinois to bypass East St. Louis by running through Salem as train number 169 in 1968. 169, later called CHZ by the Missouri Pacific, actually ran on a faster schedule in 1968, but 169 had far fewer opposing trains to contend with than does today's CHHOZ. CHHOZ is due out of Yard Center at 8:45 p.m. with cars for DuPont, Kansas City, and North Little Rock, in addition to Houston. He currently runs via East St. Louis rather than Salem and picks up and sets out at DuPont. At Missouri Junction, where UP trains leave the SP for their own track, we see what looks like the first section of the next day's SP northbound SRASQ running ahead of schedule. This SRASQ has plenty of chemicals on it, just like yesterday's. UP's trains have two routes for getting on or off of the SP tracks here at Dexter, Missouri. They can leave here at Missouri Junction or at Dexter Junction a mile to the south. The number of Southern Pacific trains through here grew to as many as 7 each way in the early 1990s as the SP added short, mostly intermodal trains to and from East St. Louis and Chicago to Texas, and also added a manifest or carload train from Chicago. The new Chicago trains utilized the track to Chicago gained from the acquisition of the Chicago, Missouri and Western in 1989. At 11:06 in the morning, southbound UP train PIHO leaves SP's track for its own track at Missouri Junction. A Chicago and Northwestern Jeep 50 leads. This is the first southbound that we saw yesterday. Today's PIHO looks just like yesterday's, with a huge number of empty tank cars and covered hoppers for chemical plants on the Gulf Coast. As you have seen, the Union Pacific today is running 18 or 19 trains through here in each direction on peak days of the week. This is the greatest number of trains run by the UP or Missouri Pacific since at least World War II, and is certainly the greatest tonnage ever. On the other hand, the Southern Pacific has recently gone again in the opposite direction. In July of this year, Southern Pacific intermodal traffic from Chicago for points in Texas, including American President's Line containers bound for Mexico via Eagle Pass, have been moved to a routing via the Illinois Central to Memphis, where they then get onto SP tracks. The Southern Pacific claims this is faster than going through East St. Louis. This has meant 1 or 2 fewer SP trains in each direction on this line. The SP is now running 4 or 5 trains in each direction, slightly more than their lowest traffic level after the Los Angeles trains were transferred to the route via Kansas City in early 1983, but otherwise the least number of SP trains or tonnage through here since the 1950s. The Southern Pacific is also suffering from a system-wide shortage of power and crews. Their service has at best been erratic. Can the SP improve their service and regain some of their lost traffic and lost glory on this line? Only time will tell. One can be quite certain that the number of Union Pacific trains on this storied joint track will only go in one direction, upwards. Our final train is northbound UP train XMQ-CHZ at Missouri Junction behind pooled Conrail power and entered SP track at Dexter Junction a mile south of here. Although symboled and extra, this train from the Mesquite Intermodal Ramp east of Dallas to Chicago runs most days of the week via Salem. Not double counting any UP trains seen twice, we have seen 18 UP southbounds and 19 northbounds, almost double the level of 20 years ago. On the other hand, we have seen 4 Southern Pacific southbounds and 5 northbounds, half of what the SP ran through here in the early 1970s. And the Blue Streak merchandise, the Cotton Belt's most famous train, no longer takes the former Cotton Belt line to Los Angeles. The competition between the two railroads here is as keen as ever, though, and it still boils over into frustration as UP trains get sidetracked for less important SP trains. The UP and SP also compete on joint track along the Missouri River between St. Louis and Kansas City, covered in Part 2 of our UP-SP River Wars series. "67 minutes later, XMQ-CHZ picks up its lunch at Illmo. I hope that you have enjoyed this look at the traffic on one of the busiest single-track lines in this country, the UP-SP joint track along the Mississippi River.